Good evening and welcome everybody. We welcome you to the fourth and final of this semester's masterclasses on critical agrarian studies. On behalf of Dr. Suresh Babu, the Dean of the School of Human Ecology, it's my pleasure to welcome you, all of you, into this masterclass. He's unfortunately not able to be here with us. So we'll kick off straight away and I'll hand over to Dr. Mekhla Krishnamurthy, our first masterclass speaker, faculty at the Ashoka University and senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, to introduce the series and today's speaker. Mekhla, over to you.
Thank you so much, Asmita, and welcome to everyone this evening or afternoon, morning, wherever you are joining us from. It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to be here today and to be a part of this masterclass series, the idea for which was really conceived by Asmita Kabra and Buddhaditya Das at the School of Human Ecology at Ambedkar University. And it's been my great privilege and pleasure to work with them on trying to put together what we hope is the first season of a series. And, over the last month, we've taken on a set of issues, beginning with agricultural markets and agrarian markets, to water, democracy, and today, rural conflicts and collective action. And the idea, I think, for us as we were thinking about the series was to pick up critical themes and to invite scholars across different disciplines who have spent time engaging deeply from different perspectives with these issues, and to try and have them step back and consider their own working through on very complex and difficult issues, but also very dynamic ones that change over time. And so we've seen a whole range of interlinkages emerge as the series has unfolded, in the discussions from markets to water to democracy. And democracy also led us very deeply into today's topic on conflict. Throughout it has also been the different relationships between land and a whole range of resources, and this wide, complex and differentiated group of humans, materials, non-humans, and different places that constitute the agrarian, both in specific times and places and also in imagination. So, it's been a real pleasure to listen and to see these interconnections unfold. As Asmita mentioned, this is the fourth and final talk for this season, the series for now. And I don't think we could have a more important and timely talk and masterclass on the questions of rural conflict and collective action than we have this week, when, as we know, there are absolutely extraordinary protests that are unfolding in Delhi. And I think many very deep questions and long-standing questions about agrarian politics, agrarian representation, of course, conflict and protest, voice, collective action, solidarity, the changing nature of demands, the relationship with the state, and both the federal and the central state are being worked out and expressed. A great deal of collective anxiety as well, but we're also beginning to see the differentiations. So the questions about, are these landed farmers? Are there new solidarities coalescing here? All of this is being raised again. And I think we could not have a better speaker than today's speaker, Kenneth Bo Nielsen, to help us think through this. I think it's really a time for us to think through it. We don't have easy answers. For us to work together to understand our way through it. So Kenneth Bo Nielsen is an associate professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo and the coordinator of the Norwegian Network for Asian Studies. He's an MA in anthropology from the University of Copenhagen and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Oslo. He's worked previously as postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bergen and at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, and has taught at various places at the University of Oslo for over a decade. His work focuses on the political economy of development in India, with a particular emphasis on land conflicts and popular movements. And he's particularly interested in how popular movements and activists mobilize the language and institutions of law in struggles over land and nature. His research interests also include Indian politics in general, from the village level to international relations. He has written extensively on the subject. So he's the author of a very important book on land dispossession and everyday politics in rural Eastern India, which was published in 2018, and co-editor of several books on various aspects of Indian democracy, including Indian democracy origins, trajectories, contestations, and social movements in the state in India, deepening democracy. He's recently co-edited a special issue of the Journal of Contemporary Asia on the politics of caste in India's new land wars, and his articles have been published in several prestigious journals, including the Journal of Peasant Studies, Journal of Contemporary Asia, Studies in Indian Politics, Focal, Environment and Planning, and the Economic and Political Weekly. So I need to say nothing more, but to say thank you so much for being with us today and for helping us work our way through this most important topic and theme. Thank you so much. I'll turn over to you. Oh, sorry. Before I forget, I will do very quick housekeeping. Now, after that nice handover, I have to do housekeeping. Okay, housekeeping rules, just for everybody to know. This is being recorded and all video and audio is on mute. However, if you do have questions, please feel very free to ask us. We've had really remarkable discussions throughout the course of the series, so we look forward to that. You could put it in the chat box and send it through to us. It would be great if you could add your affiliation or your name, where you're from. And if you're watching on YouTube and would like to send a question in, please do send it to sheconference@aud.ac.in. So without further ado, let me hand over to Kenneth.
Thank you so much for this very kind and generous introduction. It really is a great honor for me to have been invited to give a talk in this masterclass series on critical agrarian studies. I would also like to thank Professor Asmita Kapra, who reached out to me earlier this fall with the invitation. Professor Kapra and I have actually collaborated on this recent special issue on the politics of caste in India's land wars, but we have never met face to face. And in light of the COVID situation across the world, we might not actually meet face to face for quite a while. So it's been a pleasure meeting you virtually over the past several weeks for these outstanding lectures. So I have a few slides that I would like to share. They are not heavy on text, but will give you something to rest your eyes on while I speak. So I've followed these other lectures in this series with really great interest, and I think the quality has simply been outstanding. So it has, preparing for today, it has been a bit intimidating to be next in line with this talk on rural conflicts and collective action. So as I prepared, I went back and consulted the poster for this masterclass just to remind myself of what I was in fact expected to deliver and how. So this is just very briefly what the poster promises or expects from the speakers here. We see speakers in the role of teachers for advanced MA students and MPhils or PhD scholars, and we expect them to use insights from their own work to help students understand how they worked through different theoretical frameworks to arrive at the ones that they find most useful for their own field. So I've tried to structure my talk keeping in mind that the target audience is precisely advanced MA, MPhil, or PhD students who are working on, or who soon will be working on, independent research projects of their own. So what I will try to do is to use insights from my own work as an entry point for illustrating how I have worked through different theoretical frameworks in trying to come to terms with my own ethnographic material. So this means that while I will indeed be talking about rural conflicts as they happen in the real world, I will not say all that much about the substance of my own ethnographic material, but rather about how I've tried to work with that material, conceptually and analytically speaking. So while I base my talk on this book that Mekla kindly mentioned, Land Dispossession and Everyday Politics in Rural Eastern India, I will not speak in detail about what's in the book, empirically speaking. I'll rather speak about the intellectual journey that somehow enabled me to write this book, and earlier also enabled me to actually write a PhD. So if you become curious about what's actually in the book, substantially speaking, I'm afraid that you will probably have to read it yourself at some point in the future. So in speaking about my analytical journey, I will not try to argue for a particular theoretical framework somehow being better or inherently superior to other competing frameworks. The aim is somewhat more modest. The aim is to show that the utility of any theoretical framework is simply contingent upon what you want to explain, what kind of work you want your theoretical framework to do, in other words. So after giving you a short vignette-like introduction to some of my own work, I will take you on a tour of some of the theoretical frameworks that have informed my own understanding of collective action in rural India, or more specifically, collective action in the form of peasant resistance to forced land dispossession. So as Mekla also mentioned, I am an anthropologist by training, and I work and think like an anthropologist. And as my good colleague Thomas Hylland Eriksen often says, anthropologists, they try to address big issues by working in small places. So let me start by taking you to the small place where I conducted my doctoral fieldwork many years ago. Surprisingly many years ago, I actually discovered when I sat down to write this talk. This was between 2007 and 2009, with repeated follow-up shorter visits in 2014, 2015, and 2017. The setting is Singur in West Bengal, a location that became famous across India in 2006 when it was the focal point of an intense conflict over farmland that was to be acquired for Tata Motors to set up a new car factory. More specifically, close to 1,000 acres of fertile farmland in what is known as West Bengal's potato basket would be acquired and subsequently leased out to Tata Motors, who would then build a car factory to produce the company's small car, the Tata Nano that you see being burned in effigy on the right of the screen here. I should say that one cannot describe the Singur area as the kind of marginal ecology that has been discussed in some of the earlier talks. While some signs of agrarian distress were clearly visible in this area, comparable to what Mukulike Banerjee described in her Bengal village in the last talk, the area where this movement played out and where I went to do my fieldwork was generally prosperous, with strong rural-urban connections that go back more than a century, and a high level of economic diversification and pluriactivity, even though that too was sometimes precarious. So the land acquisition that I talk about affected more than 10,000 landowners and many sharecroppers and agricultural laborers, many of whom came together to organize a movement to stop this land acquisition from going ahead, and when that proved futile, to have it undone. The farmers who were thus resisting dispossession widely came to be known as unwilling farmers, in the sense that they were unwilling to give up their farmland. This land conflict and the mobilization of the unwilling farmers was among the first and undoubtedly most well-known of what the American sociologist Michael Levin has called India's new land wars that have mushroomed in the area of economic liberalization. And I will return to this theme of India's new land wars later. When I first moved to a village in Singur that I refer to as Shantipara in my book, I started to have both formal and informal conversations with some of the local farmers and movement activists. A common feature in such conversations was that these activists would present their movement as a movement of and for the entire village community. Movement activists and movement leaders would often present statements to me such as, in this movement, we are all together, we have all come together, or all the villagers in this area are with us. They would also often stress the intimate bonds that exist between villagers and their land, the land upon which they live, till and draw sustenance from. If the land would be lost and the factory set up, village life would change forever, and harmony and peacefulness would vanish, they told me. These sentiments would be reflected in popular mobilizing slogans such as, "The land is our mother, and you cannot sell your mother for money," or "We will give up our lives, but never our land." Slogans that would always figure prominently when I walked with the farmers in their rallies, attended their village meetings, or went with them on outings to Kolkata to protest there. So village unity and the almost spiritual relationship that ostensibly exists between villages and village lands were thus recurring themes during these early days of fieldwork, as indeed they were for other researchers who worked on the same movement in the same area. And there's now quite a few of us around who have one way or the other done studies of this particular movement. So now let me take you even closer to my small place in Singur through two short ethnographic vignettes from fieldwork. This is the village that I call Nadipara. And the event I describe now took place late in the evening on a cool February night in 2008 in this hamlet of Nadipara. Nadipara and the majority of the inhabitants here had over the last nearly 2 years played important roles in the local movement against land dispossession that had begun in the summer of 2006. The residents of Nadipara almost exclusively made their living as ketmojur, that is, land laborers or agricultural laborers without any land to their name, who gained their livelihood primarily from working on other people's land. With few exceptions, the inhabitants of Nadipara all belonged to the formerly untouchable Bauri caste. My field assistant and I had just left the village club, which was one of only 4 concrete buildings in Nadipara. Over the past hour or so, the village club had witnessed a heated debate between some of the ketmojur on the one hand and the movement leadership on the other hand. The leadership was generally comprised by men of the intermediate Maisho caste of clean cultivators, or Chasi, who resided in the village of Shantipara, another hamlet a few kilometers from Nadipara. Ojoy, who was an industrious young man and quite vocal too, in his 20s, had complained at the meeting that nobody in the leadership cared about the plight of Nadipara's ketmojur. The entire movement that he was supporting, he alleged, was dominated and led by local landowners, and its agenda was shaped by their desire to retain their agricultural land in the face of dispossession. Although they basically owned no land, Nadipara's ketmojur had supported the landowners in this struggle because they wanted to fight for their right to make a living as agricultural laborers by tilling other people's lands. But so far, they had gotten nothing in return, and their concerns were hardly ever raised by the movement leadership. So what Ojoy was in effect saying was that the concerns of the ketmojur and the concerns of the Chasi differed significantly, in spite of the fact that they all supported the same movement. Should the movement ultimately fail in securing the return of the land to its former owners, the landowners would still be entitled to financial compensation, but the laborers would be left high and dry, jobless, empty-handed, and with no compensation. By the time the meeting ended, Ojoy had made it perfectly clear to the movement leadership that he found it insulting to go marching in rallies shouting slogans such as, "Return the land to its owners," or "We will never give up our land." As a landless laborer, Ojoy had never had any land in the first place to give up. In effect, he felt he was fighting other people's battles, while his own concerns about the availability of local job and basically an income were left unaddressed. The movement leaders had tried to reassure Ojoy that this was all a misconception on his part. The movement, one of the leaders explained, was genuinely concerned about the plight of the Ketmojur and would continue to fight for their rights, no matter what the outcome of the movement might be. But as most of us who were present at the meeting could hear from the quarrel that he was presently having with another movement leader called Prashanto, who was a landowning chassi and a movement organizer from Shantipara, Ojoy was far from convinced by this explanation. Prashanto explained that in a movement like this, everybody should reconcile their differences and unite like brothers. But Ojoy retorted quickly that this was not so easy as long as the Ketmojur and their concerns were not given adequate attention. Another leader interfered briefly to explain that this matter would be resolved soon and that the disagreement should not escalate any further. So the leader, Prashanto, abandoned his quarrel with Ojoy and drove off into the night on his motorbike to attend another meeting elsewhere, while he mumbled a derogatory slur, "Ketmojur lok," or laboring folks, just loud enough for Ojoy to hear. Now let me shift the scene slightly through another short vignette. We now move from the mud and clay houses of Nadipara to the Durgapur Expressway that is part of National Highway number 2 and which runs just a few kilometers away from Nadipara and Shantipara. A couple of weeks after the village meeting in Nadipara, I happened to overhear another heated quarrel, and once again, Prashanto was involved. On this day, Prashanto had a heated exchange with a person I call Oshit and a woman I call Debi. Prashanto, Oshit, and Debi all supported the Singur movement and worked with the local committee to save the farmland that the farmers had set up to stop the land dispossession from going ahead. But in addition to fighting to protect the local farmland, all the people at the highway were also party politically active. Prashanto was a village-level leader of the youth wing of the Trinamool Congress that was at the time the state's leading political opposition. Oshit worked for the Mojur Kranti Parishad, or the Workers' Revolutionary Council, a small party on the far left. He did not live in Singur, but since his party was a constituent of the committee that fought the farmers' battle, he often traveled there to take part in movement events. Debi was a village-level organizer of the Socialist Unity Center, another party on the left with some local grassroots presence. Prashanto, Oshit, Debi, and I had gone to be part of a roadblock, which was a regular feature of the movement's campaign that signaled their resistance to the land acquisition, even more than a year after it had actually been carried out. But as you can probably see, the turnout was quite modest. While the movement claimed the allegiance of more than 10,000 landowners in the area, only a few hundred farmers had actually come, alongside a smaller number of urban-based social activists and party political loyalists affiliated with one or another of the parties supporting the movement. But the roadblock proceeded according to plan, as the villagers brought traffic to a standstill by either standing or lying on the road. The media and the police were present, but the atmosphere remained peaceful, even as the police repeatedly pleaded with movement leaders to call off the roadblock. After some hours following continued parleying between movement leaders and police officers, the roadblock was suspended and the protesters headed home. This calling off of the roadblock was the source of the quarrel between Prashanto, Oshit, and Debi. Prashanto felt that given the poor turnout, which wouldn't look too good on camera, and that the protesters had already made their point by blocking the road for hours, that it was reasonable to call it a day. But Oshit and Devi disagreed and accused the movement leadership of conspiring with the police in calling off the agitation. This, they said, had been a misguided decision and had sapped the roadblock of the potential of developing into a full-fledged agitation. Besides compromising with the enemy, that is, with the police, would undermine the morale of those farmers who had actually turned up. Prashanto retorted that Oshit and Devi had absolutely no right to complain. Most of the farmers on the highway, he said, were Trinamool Congress loyalists. And only when the MKP and the Socialist Unity Center one day managed to bring hundreds of people to our rallies, as he said, would they have earned the right to complain about movement tactics. This quarrel also escalated until a senior movement leader intervened to stop it. These two vignettes are all about rural conflicts and one form of collective action. Most evidently, they are stories about conflicts related to coercive land dispossession in contemporary rural India. As we know, agrarian, rural, and semi-urban areas have become focal points in ongoing struggles between peasants, governments, business, and a range of other actors over land, the uses to which land should or should not be put, and indeed who should have the right to determine what to do or not to do with land. This is, of course, not unique to India. Land grabbing is a contentious public issue in most of the world. And over the past decade, a large body of writings on what has been called the global land grab has looked at how structural adjustments, neoliberal reforms, and the opening of markets have been key drivers of land grabbing, allowing corporate entities to gain control of land and or its resources. In this context, India is, as Michael Levian has pointed out in his work, undoubtedly the global epicenter of land grab protests like the ones I have worked on in Singur. The reason has been, as we know, hugely controversial dispossession-driven projects for special economic zones, but also for infrastructure, real estate, industry, mining, and perhaps now increasingly also solar energy that have triggered popular protest in many parts of India and have put land squarely back on the political agenda as a focal point for collective action. The stories from Singur in these vignettes are thus stories about conflicts between small and marginal farmers versus a state capital nexus, and stories about village communities faced with dispossession, trying to come together to defend and protect what they hold dear and what they value. They are, in a sense, stories about people telling stories, about farmers telling stories through slogans, to the media about the justness of their struggle, and farmers telling stories to outside researchers like myself about village unity and community. Indeed, they even contain stories about farmers telling stories to each other about what kind of political formation they want their movement to be. But evidently, the vignettes also contain stories about other kinds of conflicts and the challenges of collective action. They contain stories about latent and real conflicts between different agrarian classes, in this case, relatively well-off middle peasants on the one hand, and landless laborers on the other. A conflict that in this case maps surprisingly neatly onto caste, a conflict between the middle caste Maisho and the formerly untouchable Bauri and Bhakti. They also contain stories of conflicts between different political ideologies and different political parties that penetrate the countryside and which, at least in Bengal, tend to define friendships and enmities. And not least do they contain stories about political parties fighting to lay claim to the success of a popular movement, to claim credit for the success of our rallies, as Prashanto put it at the highway. To this, we could, of course, add the many contradictions and contestations that also arise from the patriarchal constitution of rural social relations with their distinct gendered nature. One could use the stories in the vignettes to argue for the usefulness of the ethnographic method in the study of the politics of agrarian change. After all, only an ethnographer who stayed in the same place for long enough would be fortunate enough to have a chance to overhear discussions such as these. But since Mukulika Banerjee did this so eloquently in the last lecture, I would like to pursue another line of inquiry that is not about methods, but about analysis. I would rather ask, how can we as scholars of agrarian change work with and analyze such multiple, partly overlapping, partly contradictory contestations and conflicts at multiple levels of scale in a context of land dispossession? What are we to make of such strong claims to village unity and community amidst evident fissures along the lines of caste, class, and party politics? What are we to foreground and what are we to downplay when we tell our stories about conflict and collective action? This is both an analytical question, but also a question that has to do with the politics of representation. What stories of conflict and collective action do we want to tell, and how do we want to tell them? So rather than answering these questions in an abstract and normative way, I would like to address them by turning to some of the theoretical frameworks that have informed my own work, as well as the work of many other scholars on the Singur movement and its politics. And although I stay close to the ground by focusing on my particular case, I do hope that it will have relevance for other people who are interested in land politics and collective action and conflict centered on land. As already indicated, a common feature of the Singur movement and many other anti-dispossession movements was that it presented itself as a movement of and for the entire village community that was pitted against the intrusive forces of an external state and capital that had come to dispossess them. When faced with such stories and representations of conflict between a locally embedded community and outside modern institutions related to the state and capital, it is tempting to reach for the conceptual tools offered by two different but related strands of literature, namely the early subaltern studies tradition centered on Ranajit Guha and his collective of historians, and on the other, the literature on the moral economy that we associate with E.P. Thompson, and of course with James Scott in the particular context of peasant and agrarian studies. Since I have the privilege to give this talk to a masterclass organized from India, I'm sure that I do not have to explain at length the conceptual foundations of these two ways of thinking about collective political action. So let me try to do it in brief to illustrate how I have tried to work with some of the insights that can be derived from there. Put in a simplified way, the initial aim of the Subaltern Studies Collective, who borrowed the term subaltern from the writings of Gramsci, was to unearth, recover, and represent the contribution made by the people on their own, that is, independently of the elite, to the making and development of Indian nationalism. Guha's emphasis on the independence of the politics of the subaltern from the politics of the elite is significant and indicative of how the politics of the people, or popular politics, which is a term that Guha also uses, came to be posited as autonomous in the early writings of subaltern scholars. Peasant and popular politics, in this rendering, emerge not simply as a mechanic response to the machinations of shifting colonial or indigenous elites, but operated autonomously from it and according to its own cultural logic and principles of mobilization and organization. It was, in other words, characterized by a set of distinct subaltern features that set it crucially apart from the more legalistic and polished politics of the elite. Subalterns here were united by a shared subjection to conditions of exploitation and thus shared in a common condition called subalternity. Their politics was horizontal, that is, non-hierarchical, and organized along the lines of kinship, territoriality, co-residence or ritual links. It was quite often relatively violent and relied on distinct forms of informal communication, including rumor and gossip. A central argument made by leading figures of subaltern studies such as Guha and Parthu Chatterjee was that the politics of the subaltern was essentially communal rather than individualistic in character. To Chatterjee, for example, the single unifying idea which gave to peasant insurgency its fundamental social character was indeed the notion of community, to the extent that, and now I quote from Chatterjee, every aspect expresses itself in its specific political form through the principle of community. As he later writes, in peasant consciousness, solidarities do not grow because individuals feel they can come together with others because of their common individual interest. On the contrary, individuals are enjoined to act within a collective because it is believed there already exist bonds of solidarity which tie them together. In this regard, the subaltern studies tradition shares an affinity with other anthropologically informed traditions of conceptualizing peasant mobilization and peasant resistance through the trope of a moral economy. James Scott's argument is basically that peasants persistently endure exploitative conditions as a matter of routine, up until the point where exploitation becomes so severe that it violates the principles of the subsistence ethic, which holds that each person has the right to live. When this point is reached, when the moral economy is broken, that is when peasants revolt in what seem to be spontaneous uprisings, but which really isn't spontaneous at all, because it is informed by consistent moral and ethical principles with a logic of their own. Different scholars writing on the Singur movement have been inspired by such lines of thinking to different degrees. These include scholars such as Jonathan Jones, who also did his PhD work here, and my good friends Durgapur Roy and Parthu Banerjee, as well as other scholars that I will return to later. So let's have a look at how these scholars have sought to analyze this movement through the prism of peasant community or as a subaltern movement by working with its slogans and its evocative movement tropes around which collective anti-dispossession mobilization has taken place. For example, based on fieldwork in Singur, the political scientist Jonathan Jones concludes that the villagers of Singur had come together to forcefully and effectively form a united voice against land dispossession. It was, he further writes, rigorous community solidarity that enabled the villagers in Singur to quickly and spontaneously form effective organizations that ensured representation from all villagers and legitimacy from all villagers. To Jones, so-called subaltern features such as community solidarity, unity, and spontaneity are all highlighted as key drivers of collective mobilization of the entire village community in defense of the land. Similar arguments have been made by the anthropologist Durgapur Roy, whose work on Singur is probably among the best that we have. When confronted in the field with claims of village unity and solidarity as the basis for the movement she came to study, she too is pushed to examine what this kind of representation means. Her conclusion is that, and I quote from her work, the move to acquire the entire agricultural land of the village has probably helped the process of formation of collective solidarity cutting across caste and class lines. Adding that such alliances and solidarity are a reflection of people responding more on a community basis and for the community interest. Thus, while she acknowledges that caste and class are indeed key markers of everyday rural social distinction, something that Jones, in contrast, is almost entirely silent about, Roy still stresses how the community formed around village solidarity is the key driver of the local mobilization against land dispossession. To give you one final illustration of how this subaltern studies framework has been used to conceptually frame and study the Singur movement, I give you this conclusion from another study by Paul and Dutto, who have also interviewed many movement supporters in Singur. Based on this, they conclude that the Singur land activists represent an autonomous subaltern culture that challenges the wealth accumulation, market economy, consumerism, and trading of capital goods, labor, land, and money championed in the modernist idea of development. These are tall claims indeed, and perhaps the most explicit framing of this particular movement as a case of an autonomous subaltern mobilization confronted with intrusive modern outside institutions. Nonetheless, even if we might conclude that Paul and Dutto go too far in pronouncing the subaltern nature of this particular movement, this doesn't mean that we should be entirely dismissive of arguments that draw inspiration from this particular way of thinking and from ideas about village unity and community. Indeed, as Mukulika Banerjee showed us last time, the harvest might be one such event where ideas about community and care actually manifest in social village life, even if the harvest in my study area relied more heavily on migrant labor from other districts, or even from Jharkhand, labor that could more easily be disciplined. We also know from more recent village studies that villagers, at least sometimes and in certain situations, tend to think about themselves and the village as an important social unit in its own right. So the argument that collective organization can be framed as a peasant community faced with outside intrusive forces might have some merit, and it's not hard to find empirical evidence that can support such a reading. Indeed, part of the movement's strategy of self-representation was precisely to highlight those aspects of village unity, community, and solidarity. However, if such subaltern thinking is good at explaining unity, coherence, and resistance, it is not quite as good when it comes to explaining what the anthropologist Jason Keith Fernandez in a recent book on Goa has called scales of subalternity, or what we may call variation within and between different categories of subalterns. Within subalternist thinking, where is the room for conflict related to the agrarian class structure between landowners and laborers? Where is the room for internal caste differentiation within the deceptive category of peasant community, or even unwilling farmer in this case? These are not trivial questions, and we know, for example, from the critical literature on India's new farmers' movements that flourished in the 1980s and 1990s, that agrarian populism and its attendant claims to precisely unity and community can also often function to obscure from view those power relations that are at work within rural and agrarian settings. Moreover, what are we to make analytically of the fact that a good number of local peasants did in fact quite willingly hand over their land to Tata Motors? How is that possible within a community way of thinking? And how are we to deal with the fact that the Singur movement was by no means autonomous from modern institutions, but rather deeply entangled in modern party politics, as we have seen in one of the vignettes, as well as in NGO networks and a large number of court cases that played out almost across the country, and so on? There seemed to be very little scope for grappling analytically with these kinds of questions if one remained too staunchly committed to taking the discourse of village unity and community at face value. So these and related doubts and questions gradually led me to see subalternity and the village community and village unity not so much as empirical facts that we could take for granted, but more as moral and political claims made by a section of dispossessed farmers in pursuit of political support. By recasting the issue of community and solidarity in this way, as claims and not as facts, the interesting thing to do, analytically speaking, is thus not to try to decide once and for all whether such claims about community solidarity as the deep moral basis from which collective action flows is true or not, or conversely, whether such claims are intentionally designed to mask class conflict. Now, the interesting question comes to be why such inherently political claims about the moral force of the village community come to be articulated, and why they resonate so broadly among a wider public, and why they may have or fail to have mobilizing potential and political impact. When I began in my own work to think about these questions and have doubts about how to continue working with the material I was left with, I had a bit of good luck that we sometimes fortunately have. I was grappling with these challenges and questions just a few years after Partha Chatterjee had published his seminal book titled The Politics of the Governed. And around the time that he published another article that would become very influential in Economic and Political Weekly, an article that was titled Democracy and Economic Transformation. These publications are best known for the ways in which Chatterjee introduces and discusses his concept of political society, and I will return to this later on. But for now, I'll just point out that in the latter article about democracy and economic transformation, he in fact begins precisely by discussing the land conflicts in Singur and Nandigram in West Bengal that unfolded at the time that I was doing my fieldwork. Reflecting on these two land conflicts, he writes, and I now quote from the article in EPW, "If these incidents had taken place 25 years ago, we would have seen in them the classic signs of peasant insurgency. Here were the long familiar features of a peasantry tied to the land and small-scale agriculture, united by the cultural and moral bonds of a local rural community, resisting the agents of an external state and of city-based commercial institutions by using both peaceful and violent means. I believe that analysis would be inappropriate today." So what Chatterjee does in this brief quote is in effect to more or less debunk the relevance of the classical subaltern formulation of peasant politics. In doing so, he seeks to move subaltern politics out of its original autonomous domain by stressing the relatively recent forms of the entanglement of elite and subaltern politics as the constitutive element of popular politics today. And he identifies several reasons that underlie this recent entanglement of these two political domains, but it would, I'm afraid, take me too far off track to cover all of them here. Suffice it to say, for the purpose at hand, that the broader implication of Chatterjee's shift towards popular rather than subaltern politics is that it shifts the analytical focus in a subtle way away from attempting to unearth the authentic, autonomous voice of the subaltern or the peasant, to tracing the entangled process through which collective politics is actually constituted. What I found particularly interesting in Chatterjee's work at the time is his argument that people who were excluded from the domain of civil society proper have a very different relation to the state than do so-called full citizens. People who are thus excluded are confined to the domain of what he calls political society, where they are governed as population groups who cannot and who do not claim rights as individuals, but who claim concessions and exceptions from the state as a population group, quite often not with reference to the law, but in violation of it. Indeed, the efficacy of this kind of popular politics is not derived from the fact that it plays out on a terrain where rules rule. Rather, it derives its efficacy from being played out on a terrain where rules and laws may be bent or stretched. The better organized, the better connected, and the more mobilized through whatever means a group is, the larger is its impact on policy and governance likely to be. Hence, in political society, population groups pick their way through the uncertain terrain by making a large array of connections and by constantly readapting, coping with, responding to, and making use of changing initiatives, opportunities, or policies. As part of this strategy, Chatterjee writes, such populations, however they are defined, may work to strategically articulate their claims in the moral language of community. Now, reading Chatterjee at this time in my own analytical journey was, in a sense, a great source of inspiration. And I started to think of the movement that I had come to study along those lines. The forced land dispossession in Singur was, in a way, a governmental intervention that had created two new population groups that did not exist prior to dispossession, namely the willing farmers and the unwilling farmers. Prior to the land acquisition, these were entirely meaningless categories that didn't even exist. When the land acquisition was announced, however, these two categories became significant local categories through which the self and the other were identified, as people began to speak of themselves as part of either the Jomidewardal, or the land givers group, or the non-land givers group. These were entirely new categories that suddenly came to define new collectivities. In addition, there were also media categories used by different journalists to write about Singur. And they were also categories of government and even legal categories, since they determined who could claim compensation for their land, who could claim the additional solatium granted only to people who gave their land willingly, and which defined who was entitled to reskilling and apprenticeships in the Tata factory. These categories even had a certain legal standing insofar as they defined who could challenge the land acquisition in court, and so on. As such, these categories of unwilling farmer and its twin category, the willing farmer, soon came to define the collective political identity that was in fact available to those in Singur who opposed the land acquisition. So based on this line of thinking rooted in Chatterjee's framework, I came to see much of the grassroots work being carried out by movement activists locally as attempts at filling this category of unwilling farmer with some kind of meaningful local content, so as to infuse it strategically with the moral language of community. Both to garner local support, but crucially also to raise the moral force of their claims vis-à-vis powerful outsiders. Hence, the continuous efforts made by local activists to mobilize people for events such as the roadblock, to show to people themselves, but also to the world, if you like, that the category of the unwilling farmer actually had an empirical reference in the real world. And also the activists' concern about putting on a show, if you like, in front of the media to portray their resistance as a kind of moral outrage on the part of dispossessed farmers. What the vignettes I presented in this way can be said to show is how hard it was, in fact, for local activists to fill this category of the unwilling farmer with some kind of meaningful moral content. For landless laborers, it was very hard to identify as an unwilling farmer with all that implies of land ownership and social status. Similarly, the highly gendered nature of the category of the farmer also strongly influenced the political positions that could be available to women activists. These were some of the many conflicts within the conflicts, if you like, that local movement activists had to navigate as they sought to appropriate, work with, and mobilize around the governmental category of unwilling farmer to produce and sustain collective action across class, caste, and political divides. As such, moral claims to community constantly had to be produced and could not be taken for granted. The trouble with Chatterjee's framework, as many of his critics have pointed out, is that his thinking is highly generic. Empirically, he writes mostly about Bengal, mostly about Calcutta, but he claims to offer insights about popular politics in most of the world, as the subtitle of his 2004 book will have it. Now, I love Bengal as much as many of us here, but this is nonetheless a rather tall claim that the Bengali experience can be made to stand in for popular politics in most of the world. So for these and other reasons, one might reasonably ask questions such as, does collective action and popular politics centered on land dispossession share the same generic qualities as other kinds of popular politics? Does an anti-dispossession movement follow the same pattern, the same forms of mobilization, and the same strategies of action as, for example, slum dwellers wanting clean drinking water, or homeless squatters wanting an electricity connection? Might there be important differences between the more or less routine politics of transactionalist bargains that are part and parcel of political society and the kind of urgent mobilization that follows from large scale and sudden land dispossession in rural areas? In short, what is specific about collective action in a context of land dispossession? At the time when I found myself confronted with these questions, we simply didn't really have much of an answer to them. As Michael Levin remarked in an article on India's new land wars as late as in 2012, these new land conflicts that were centered on land dispossession had only to a fairly limited extent been subject to long ethnographic work. So at the time, there were quite few comparative studies that could help me advance my own thinking about these questions of the particularities of collective popular politics centered on land dispossession. But as it happened, Michael Levin was evidently grappling with the same set of questions around the same time, which he later addressed at length in an article from 2013 that he titled Theorizing India's New Land Wars. In this article, Levin argues that Chatterjee's concept of political society is indeed much too broad to capture the particular dynamics that emerge out of the specific act of land dispossession. In dispensing with political society as an analytical category, Levin argues that we need to be mindful of how the dispossession of land creates a specific kind of politics that imbues India's anti-dispossession movements with 6 generic features that pertain to their targets, their strategy and tactics, their organization, their social composition, their goals, and their ideologies. Briefly put, his analysis proceeds along these lines. Many controversial land acquisitions, including that in Singur, have been carried out by force through the intervention of a coercive agent, usually the state. A land dispossession constitutes a total and one-time threat to people's means of production and subsistence. And they offer only a singular opportunity to actually save the land. Land dispossession also cuts indiscriminately across pre-existing forms of political organization and already formed classes. In other words, land dispossession affect the rich and the poor, and tenants and laborers alike. These features in combination give rise, Levin argues, to a specific form of anti-dispossession politics. They mean that movements to protect farmland are entangled in an immediately antagonistic relationship with the state, or more precisely, specific arms of the state, which become their main target. Anti-dispossession movements are thus urgent struggle that privilege overt resistance over more covert forms of politics. They are born as independent people's movements that are autonomous from political parties and that as a rule have only a single issue agenda of stopping land dispossession. And they are, in Levian's words, unavoidably cross-class movements that by necessity de-emphasize local class antagonisms in order to optimize cross-class solidarity. They usually embody different goals and agendas, with some activists being transactional bargainers who will in fact settle for higher compensation, while others are unconditional barricaders who will never give up their land under any circumstances. And lastly, because they are single-issue movements, they tend to operate with no larger ideological framework. This, in turn, makes them susceptible to incorporation into a variety of different ideological universes, including Maoism, regionalism, and populism. Now, this admittedly very generic framework for making sense of anti-dispossession mobilization very effectively places the act of dispossession at the center of analysis. In this sense, I found Levian's framework for understanding collective mobilization against land dispossession to be much more attuned to their specificities and diversity across time and space. As I show in greater detail in the book on Singur, his approach helps us make sense of many defining features of the movement there, especially in its early stages. For example, the urgency with which the unwilling farmers mobilized almost as soon as they heard that their land would be taken from them. Their strategy of openly targeting the state, and particularly the chief minister who you see on the slide here. And also of intimidating state officials, as well as the many violent clashes with the police that had ensued. I think the framework also helped me to capture and explain the single issue agenda that the movement ostensibly had, namely that of saving the farmland, as expressed by Prashanto during the village meeting that I began with, when he admonished Ojoy that in a movement such as this, that is a movement focused on a single issue, we all have to unite like brothers and otherwise forget our differences. Levian's way of theorizing about India's new land wars is also good to think with if we are to explain why and how multiple and sometimes antagonistic rural classes and castes would rally behind the same movement. Because land dispossession affected them all in one way or another, leading to efforts by movement organizers at continuously de-emphasizing the social differences and distinctions along the lines of caste and class that are otherwise routine parts of everyday village life. And not least, Levian can help us make sense of the attempts by the different political party activists that we encountered along the Durgapur Expressway at incorporating this single-issue, non-political movement into their respective ideological and party political universes, and the kind of intense debate and conflict this also led to. I started writing through some of my material from Singur with Levian's generic framework in mind, and as I indicated just now, that greatly helped me to think about and analyzing big and small events, such as those I presented in my opening vignettes. Events that spoke about the urgency of resistance, of continued attempts at de-emphasizing and diffusing social differences along lines of caste and class in order to build up some kind of social basis for collective political action, and also to make sense of confrontational strategies versus more accommodating ones. And yet, after writing through my material in this way for some time, I started to wonder whether there was a certain ethnographic excess in my material that could not quite be captured by the ways in which Levian theorized India's new land wars. I had followed the Singur movement at rather close hand for around 2 years on and off, from 2007 until 2009. And I had seen for myself how it changed and evolved over time. The urgent and violent resistance that had marked the early months of the movement had gradually subsided and had been replaced by numerous court cases that dragged on very peacefully over many years, coupled with only sporadic mobilization that increasingly came more symbolic than urgent. I had also come to see how there was nothing unavoidable about anti-dispossession movements such as the one in Singur becoming cross-class or cross-caste. Indeed, as the quarrel between Ojoy and Prosciutto showed, and as I have written about elsewhere as well, cross-class and cross-caste alliances can be very difficult to maintain over time, and they require constant attention and care. Otherwise, they easily break down, as indeed they did frequently when I studied the movement. The same could be said about the multi-constituent nature of the so-called independent movement, which was equally hard to maintain over time, as many different political parties and many different groups sought to incorporate this single-issue movement into their own party political projects, both locally and at the state level, where, of course, the current chief minister has been presenting herself as a champion of this movement as well. So in short, there were multiple changes happening within this movement over time, which pushed against the boundaries of Levian's framework and perhaps even exceeded it occasionally. And the key phrase here, I think, that there were things happening over time. Indeed, attention to time and temporality can be said to be essential to ethnographic work because we work in time. But in Levian's framework, there is perhaps less attention to the temporal dimension of collective political action. To be fair, the framework is intentionally generic and designed to be so. But such generic accounts of the politics of India's new land wars can be said to be written in a kind of ethnographic present, understood as the practice of giving accounts of other people and societies in the present tense. As witnessed, for example, in phrases such as anti-dispossession movements are single-issue movements, or anti-dispossession movements are unavoidably cross-class movements. We know from Johannes Fabian and others that the function and effect of writing about other people in the ethnographic present can be a kind of freezing of time, of taking the people and society so described out of the time stream of history, with the risk of essentializing groups of people out of time, so to speak. Thinking about the temporality of collective action in this particular context made me realize that while Levian gives us an outstanding account of the birth and early life of collective anti-dispossession mobilization, he cannot, or is perhaps not interested in, telling the life story of such kinds of mobilizations. That is when I realized that my story of the Singur movement, the story that I could tell about collective anti-dispossession politics, had to place temporality and everyday life at the center. It had to be a story about how people do movement, so to say. That is, about how people manage to mobilize and organize collectively in a context where everyday life has to go on. It also had to be a story about how collective action changes over time, and not least, what processes of collective action do to everyday life and local social relations. I wanted to tell my story in such a way that it could do justice to my long-term experience as an ethnographer. This is not necessarily a better story than what others have told about land conflicts and collective action, nor is it necessarily a better analysis of the case at hand than what others have provided. And indeed, I hope that I have shown that all the other approaches that I have worked my way through along the way have all been capable of shedding analytical light on the issue we are discussing today. and I draw on all of them with great gratitude in my book as well. But most importantly, from my own very personal viewpoint, what these alternative and very many different approaches helped me to achieve was to find, in a sense, my own story, my own narrative of my ethnographic case, the story that I could tell about peasant mobilization and collective action, and the story that I thought it made sense to tell. And on that note, I will end my talk and thank you all for your attention.
Kenneth, that was that was a really, really amazing walkthrough of extremely complex terrains. And while so I was just typing in the box and requesting the audience to post their questions here. Let me see if there are some questions coming. I have quite a few of my own, but I think we'll just let you take a breath and wait for audience questions to come in. I also invite Mekla, Buddhaditya, others to come in, please. Right. So while people are still mulling over this, wonderful journey that you've taken us through, covering theoretical material and how does a researcher sort of take, the material that you've learned about earlier and juxtapose it against what they actually observe on the ground. I'm struck by the fact that, the narrative that you've described. I mean, when governments talk to us about dispossession, etc., there's and land and conflict and collective action. There are promises in it about the process of development and where, so how, I mean, if you'd like to reflect a little bit about the linkages between collective action or the absence of collective action and the very sort of imagination of development in rural areas. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Thanks for posing this question. It's an immensely complicated thing to discuss. I can perhaps start by going back to some of my own experience from coming into this study of this particular movement and perhaps broaden that out subsequently. It is true that they're taking the concrete case as a point of departure, that there were very specific promises being made about what industrialization would achieve for rural areas in and around Singur, in the specific nature of jobs of various sorts, but also overall development. And it's not as if these kinds of arguments had no local takers, and I think that has to be understood in light of the kind of aspirations that we find in many parts of rural India, which Dipankar Gupta wrote about in a very provocative article in EPW back in 2005 about India's withering villages and about how people's aspirations for the good life increasingly tend to leave agriculture behind and imagine other kinds of desired futures. At the same time, I think most people are perfectly capable of having multiple ideas and thoughts in their own head at the same time. And to go back to the villages where I studied, as a matter of principle, almost everybody I knew would welcome industrialization. There was no principled objection to bringing industries and jobs to rural areas. But there were concerns about equity, about what would happen to those jobs, and the flow of the benefits that derive from when these processes hit rural areas, where many people had first-hand experience from being in the informal labor market in different, not only different parts of Bengal, but different parts of India. So a large amount of labor migration out from these areas. So people knew very well how precarious those kinds of opportunities also tended to be. So that was one observation. I think the other observation that I would make, with particular reference to the fact that this concerns land dispossession, is that it's very clear to people what is being taken away from them. If you take away 1,000 acres of land, that is there for all to see. And people know that will happen, but it's often opaque what will flow in or what will come out of it. And I think the comparative cases of different kinds of I don't know if we should call it development-induced dispossession, so let's just call it dispossession perhaps, is that the possibilities and the resources that are generated when new projects come in and are based on land dispossession is that many of these benefits are highly unevenly distributed. It's not as if they neatly follow pre-existing caste or class lines, but there is a clear pattern in the way that people are already positioned in agrarian contexts. Tends to have a very strong influence about what people can make of these opportunities that come in. As a closing comment, I am also interested in this. I've worked a bit with a colleague on what we call compounding aspirations. That is a concept we have tried to develop to try to make sense of how people come to nurture aspirations that might in fact be detrimental to their own material interests, and this is something I think there's much work to be done, I think, on agrarian aspirations and rural aspirations and the kind of imaginaries that shape how people respond to land dispossession and what motivates or demotivates people from mobilizing politically around land questions today.
Thank you so much. The questions are coming in, and I think I'll take the second question that came in first because it ties to what you just said about, the sort of that people can see what they're losing, but they can't really see what they're gaining, and probably, what. I mean, the question that we have from David Singh from Copenhagen University is about what Levin refers to as the sort of in his notion of regimes, on what creates legitimacy for certain kinds of dispossession, but not for others. He's of course thanking you very much for the presentation and the way in which you made the theory talk to the field, and he's asking, in the context of his own work on wind farm development in Gujarat, whether the anti-dispossession politics you describe also applies to dispossession for apparent green reasons, or do you think there's a sort of dispossession for green, so-called green purposes, has other kinds of legitimacy associated with it?
That's a very intriguing question. It's nice to get a question from Copenhagen, where I studied myself for for quite a number of years, and it's good to know that that there are people there who are interested in the same issues. This is a very complicated question to answer, I think. I try to think when I think about dispossession. I'm very inspired by the idea of different regimes of dispossession that Levin also talks about, and it's something that I've tried to ground a bit on the state level in my more recent work in Goa, try to see how do state-specific regimes work when it comes to dispossessing people of their land. And sort of the big distinction in the way Levian speaks about these regimes is between the Nehruvian regime of dispossession, which he would argue enjoyed widespread legitimacy, which means that in the name of national development and post-colonial nation building, the Nehruvian state could actually get away with dispossessing a very large number of Indians for steel towns and dams and other related development, because they could be justified with reference to this idea of doing good for the nation. Whereas in the current context, it's much more difficult to justify dispossession because it's increasingly evident to people who benefits if you dispossess people from building real estate. People know that that's not. People have a clear idea where the money flows, so to speak. So I think we have seen perhaps in general that dispossession today is of course much more contentious. I have a colleague who has worked on solar energy in Kerala, and also some of the conflicts that have arisen because these solar farms, if you like, they require large areas, and then empty lands is of course in very short supply in India. So we might be in a terrain of some of the finer nuances here. Land dispossession in general, I would consider to be contentious today. There might be finer nuances in the sense that special economic zones and mining might be slightly more controversial than green projects. It is a possibility that there might be a greater degree of popular acceptance, not particularly among the people who are actually dispossessed, but in the broader society that surrounds them. I think there has been attempts at some kind of comparative study where you disaggregate by sector, so to speak. You look at what is the purpose for which land is being dispossessed, and is this somehow related to the degree of local resistance or lack thereof. But I'm not really sure if these results are now widely available. But it's an interesting research agenda, looking at sectors and the reasons for dispossession, and to what extent that correlates with resistance, because that is an empirical question to be explored.
Thank you. And I'd like actually David to also, I mean, this is of particular interest to me because I look at conservation and dispossession caused due to conservation and how responses around that occur. And the regime-ness is something which I think Buddhaditya and I are writing about this in the context of conservation in India, and we'll due to sort of look at some of that. Hopefully, sometime soon that will be coming out. But moving on, here's a question from Dr. Buddhaditya Das from the School of Human Ecology, who's saying that the categories of willing and unwilling farmers underline the question of consent, a question that is key to politics in and around land dispossession and conflicts. And could you reflect a little on the relationship between individual consent and collective action?
I can try to do it at perhaps two levels. Again, starting from my own specific experience, and then perhaps saying something slightly more general. The question of consent is very difficult, because it's a fine line between consent and compliance, you might say, because I mean, if people consent to letting go of their land, it's we can't assume that this is something they do because they wholeheartedly support what is being offered to them or what is being proposed. It may also be because they have a very realistic impression of what is politically possible and what is politically feasible. So I think that is that is one thing. Then there's of course the whole social context around consent questions, and I don't I don't know if we have time to go into this, but of course, um, speaking about the Singur case, well, one thing that that was very soon brought to people's attention was, of course, the relatively poor state of land records. Not only in this part of Bengal, but perhaps more generally. There were large discrepancies between who was the formal owner, who had the formal right to give or withhold consent, and who had access and who had control, simply because land records had not been updated for some time. So there's a complex consent picture, which means that some people willingly gave consent to be dispossessed of land that they had in fact sold many years ago. Then there's also the question of family and kinship networks, about in this particular case, brothers who living within the same household who also had different ideas about what should happen to the family land, and who owned individuals' plots that they would and wouldn't give. So it's clear that the sort of consent, compliance, and refusal creates a very mixed basis for collective action, and I think that was one challenge that that the activists I worked with was faced with, that there was no sort of there was no uniform community response that they could, in a sense, build on. There were families, caste groups, neighborhoods making decisions and sticking by them or not sticking by them, and what they were left with was a kind of a amorphous mass of people who were against this, spread out over a rather large geographical area that they should somehow try to build a basis for. I know, if I may speak about the Levin's case study too, because that's an interesting case where from Rajasthan, where as a compensation they offer the dispossessed small individual land plots for that would be redeveloped, and in that way they individualize the landowners' relations with the state. It's as an individual you make your own decision whether to consent or not, and it's that is, whether it's an intentional strategy from above or whether it isn't, I shan't comment on, but it's a can be a very effective way of undermining the potential for local collective action if you individualize the relationship in which dispossession plays out. It immediately becomes more challenging to construct some kind of collective basis for stopping dispossession from moving ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. The questions are pouring in now, so I'll try and see if I can club some of them. I think there's a couple of questions that tie up in terms of, in terms of the differential outcomes of dispossession. And so let me just see if I can pick those two up. And then there's a couple of questions on, which are about unpacking the state itself. Which I think I'll take up later for you, Kenneth. And so here's a question which has come to us from Rahul Shah, who's watching us on YouTube. And he's saying, how does the idea of solidarity play out in rural collective action, given the complexities of caste, class, etc.? So I think he's hinting at, the intimate exclusions that happen, as Tanya Lee says, on an everyday basis, prior to the moment of dispossession, and then, when dispossession happens, how does solidarity happen across these fractured societies? And Survi Nayak, who's a PhD student at the Center for Development Studies, also has a similar question, which is also tying up to this fascinating, notion that you spoke about of the temporal aspects of collective action. Would you like to reflect on the puzzle that she witnesses in the case of coal mining displacement in eastern India, where the anti-dispossession movement, the resistance by landed upper castes over time, translates into negotiations for compensation. And it is the upper castes who primarily resisted the dispossession, but they're the ones who are then mostly benefiting in terms of employment outcomes, while the landed lower castes are left out. That's quite a handful of questions. So I'll give you to think through these and respond to them, please.
Thank you. These are wonderful, but also very challenging questions. What I think to once again start from my own work and then build out. I think it's right to think about the urgency of land dispossession politics, and both from following the West Bengal media in 2005, 2006. I mean, we to give a bit of context, the communist government had just been re-elected to office in 2006 on a platform of industrialization, and so it was no surprise that there would be attempts at an industrialization drive subsequently. And there were rumors that Tata might be coming to Bengal, but the land acquisition itself was in a sense announced out of the blue, you might say, and in the kind of fashion or modus way of operating that characterized communist rule in Bengal at the time, that you had enough confidence in your local cadre that they would make people come around to this and that they would comply, and then of course it backfired. So I think there's something that can be said for the argument about the news of a land dispossession coming kind of out of the blue, that creates a kind of sense of urgency that does somehow enable people to see reason in the argument that since this affects us all negatively, the way we organize should reflect this, and so my idea of having this the dimension of temporality is that people don't live in a sense of urgency for 15 years when they fight against a case of land dispossession. Everyday life has to go on, no? Food needs to be put on the table. Children need to be looked after. There are social obligations that you need to fulfill as best you can. So the everydayness of social life, although it might be altered by the threat of dispossession, somehow reasserts itself. And that was, in a sense, how my attention was drawn to these fissures along the lines of caste and class, and also gender, which I did not speak about today because there wasn't enough time, but which I write about in the book and in a few articles as well. That there's, I mean, the everydayness of social life it reasserts itself, although it does so in conversation with collective mobilization. And I think that's the case from Eastern India that's mentioned here is, of course, very interesting. That we have an upper caste control of the movement, as at the same time that we have the same social segment standing to benefit from the kind of project that is being pushed through there. It's not uncommon, I think, to find that there are, within these movements, one will find constituents that are ready to compromise and who see the aim of such a mobilization as enhancing the quality of the compensation or the size of the compensation. I think that's probably normal. And it's so you might find that people will be coming and going from the movement to some extent. I recognize it also from my own fieldwork, that there were people who were ready to leave if the offer was good enough, and there were people who were ready to return if having realized that the compensation they had been given was was less than what they had thought. That was perhaps an unsatisfactory answer to this. I mean, in a sense, it has to be an empirical question. I think that has to be explored empirically with a keen sense of attention to the particularities of the local context if we want to understand how these solidarities are formed. I mean, we can't assume that they everywhere take shape in the same way. I think we need to be attentive to precisely those cleavages and also solidarities that are organized, that exist locally, and where class and caste and gender will always, in their specific way, have something to say.
Thank you. I don't know how we're going to do justice to the wonderful questions, and there's just tremendous amounts of appreciation pouring in, Kenneth, for the way you've put this material together. I want to take up a question from Amit, who's a PhD student at the School of Human Ecology, and Mekla has then added to his question on the local state. Amit actually has two questions. He's curious how the local, state, and rural collective action shape each other in the short and the long term. And do actors of the local state in the rural regions resist this sort of state apparatus due to collective action? And interestingly, he's, I think, hinting at the different nature of the community in urban areas and asking, does collective action then differ in urban areas, which you might want to take up, at a later stage. But Mekla is adding to Amit's question on the local state and asking, is there a possibility that because collective action has to work so hard to overcome differentiation and intimate local conflicts, that they actually strengthen the case for centralization in policy and work against decentralization and decentralized institutional capacity? Over to you again.
Thank you. These are excellent. I think I have to think about the second part of the question for some time before being capable of saying something sensible. Because that was a bit of a challenge. The first one on the local state is also very interesting, and to be honest, that has in my own work, the local state has remained not entirely a black box, but a component that I have researched to a lesser extent than what I, in retrospect, wish I had. This was partly for practical reasons. The local panchayats and many of the local state institutions at the time were controlled by the CPM, and I had come to work with a movement where many of the activists were Trinamool Congress supporters, or because of the land acquisition, hostile to the communist parties. So in a sense, I tried to stay a bit away, if you say, from state institutions that were configured in this way. What I think is important is not to overdraw this distinction between the local state and the movement. I mean, in my case, it was a bit of a peculiar situation because if memory serves me well, I'm rather sure, and I've read about this from other people who have worked more with the local state and the local panchayats and the local committees of the CPM in this part of Bengal, that the government plan was in a way to announce this project in a big way and then to count on the local cadres, who were, of course, both in the party but also in the panchayat, to produce local compliance or consent, and that of course failed. But what I quickly noticed after working in Singur for a couple of months, and this became perhaps increasingly clear in 2008 when there were panchayat elections in Bengal, that many of the movement activists, they stood for elections. They at both at all three levels of the panchayat actually, and many were elected. So and there was a change of control in in the Gram Panchayat and in the very localized institutions of village self-governance, which are powerful in Bengal. So there was an attempt by the movement actually at capturing the local state at the low and intermediate level, and they knew perfectly well that the Gram Panchayat wasn't empowered to do anything about the land acquisition. That was, of course, located in Kolkata. But local state institutions control resources, and they control access to Narega, 100 days work, and they control who gets to benefit from different welfare schemes, and who is given work and who is not. So the control of the local state could actually be used to sustain this movement in the long run, in the sense that benefits from the panchayat office and from the block development office could be channeled to people who were supporters of the movement, because many had fallen on hard times. So so there was much more of a sort of a dialectic between what goes on within a movement and what goes on at in the local state. And looking back, this is something that I wish I would have worked more on myself. I mean, the relations between, particularly, of course, the different levels of the panchayat and the movement. While I've been speaking, I've had a chance to think about Mekla's question. I must say, I'm not. This is a very big question, I think. And I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer for this. I mean, it's an intriguing thing to think about, but I don't think I would like to offer an answer until I've had the chance to think even more about it. So apologies for now, Megla.
Sure. I am going to take up a question from Shaina Sehgal, who's a PhD scholar at the School of Human Ecology. And Shaina says that she's trying to explore the synergies between the earlier and the first and the last master classes in this series, that is Mekla's and yours. And she says, I observed this during my doctoral field work, where a relay hunger strike for implementing minimum support price co-opted cultivators across ethnic lines who had otherwise no interaction and probably very different cultivation practices. So can we use the framework that you've outlined to look at issues of collective action in, say, agrarian markets or in other agrarian issues, and not necessarily just land dispossession? And she's saying it's also sounding like a very promising way to analyze ongoing farmers' protests in India as we speak.
Thank you for this question. I mean, I would love it if this somehow resonated beyond the land dispossession work that I have been doing, and I've been trying to stay updated on, or at least follow to the best of my ability the kind of farmers protests that are happening now, which also from what I managed to read have had some kind of success in bringing otherwise more or less antagonistic groups onto maybe not a common platform, but at least a shared kind of practice. And the relay hunger strike, I was part to one or two of those as well. That was a favored technique also among many of the farmers I worked with, also because it enables participation. I mean, it lowers the threshold. You don't have to sit there for a full week. You can come and you can do your turn, and you become part of it. So what I liked about this question, and what I think is important to think about also, is that it focuses our attention on practice. What is it people do when they do a movement? And I think it's important to think precisely in terms of taking practice seriously. I mean, if you manage to physically bring people together and participate in a shared kind of activity, that might actually do something. about how people relate to each other. And especially if you manage to bring people together who would normally not be present in the same social space, or perhaps not with the same kind of proximity. So I think this practice dimension is really makes for a very good analytical entry point. And I think it's also possible to think about practice in tandem with what I tried to say about temporality. Yeah? Because I think it's clear that collective political action, that opens up new social spaces for people to be together in different ways, and that can play out in all kinds of ways, depending on social positions, but also personality and personal habits. So, to what extent can these new practices that occur within movements generate new ways of thinking about oneself and one's relations to other people? And here I think that there's something really, really interesting to explore. That it's not necessarily the kind of ideological work that movements do to change people's ways of thinking, but it may just as well be the kind of practices that movements organize that bring people together in new ways, and through practice over time might succeed in changing the way people think and act jointly. So this was a very a question that's extremely good to think with, and which I intuitively think might be something that one can work with in very many different contexts where some form of collective political work takes place.
Great. We have probably another 12 minutes to go. And I'm picking up a question from Sabha Joshi, who's writing to us from the University of Oxford. And a similar question from Bhupendra, who did not give his institutional affiliation. So Sabha is asking, and I think you've touched upon it a little bit. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how a temporal centered framework helped, if at all, in making sense of gender relations in mobilization and the politics of dispossession. Would you argue that focusing on the everyday makes gender politics more visible in land struggles? Bhupendra, on the other hand, is asking, in response to your critique of subaltern studies, how you understand the silencing of Dalit communities in everyday rural politics and in theorizing India's new land wars. So I think the claim is that there is a silencing of Dalit communities, and then he's asking, how do you understand this?
Thank you so much to the two of you who posed these questions. The silencing of Dalit politics, yes, I think that's true. I don't think that's unique to anti-dispossession movements. I think that will, to a greater or lesser extent, be true for many different kinds of rural social movements in post-colonial India. How to make sense of that theoretically? I mean, at one sense, it can be both very very simple and very complicated. And I've perhaps tried to struggle with in my own work to think this intersection between caste and class and what emerges as significant. Often it will be the intersection of the two, but it might also be that one or another of these two things are more significant depending on the local ethnographic context. So this is likely to vary, I think, depending on where one does one's work. Thinking this through in terms of subaltern studies is, I think, it's perhaps easier to address, I think, if one looks at the Chatterjee's framework and his ways of thinking about politics of the governed, and which is to me surprisingly silent about many of these hierarchies of everyday life that one would assume would be so important to come to terms with analytically, if one is to formulate a framework for studying popular politics. It might be because he too is rather generic in the way he formulates his view of the politics of political society. But this is something that has been picked up by quite a number of his critics, I think. Where is caste in all of this? So I think that there's a lively discussion going on, also conceptually about these issues. I'm very happy that the gender dimension was brought up in this question now. And does an everyday perspective help to bring to the forefront gender dimension? I think my answer would probably be yes, and it in quite a number of different ways. I think one has to do with the I mean one is ideological, if you like, the patriarchal constitution of political society, which define more or less different positions to men and women when it comes to political action. But I think also something as everyday as observing the domestic routines of women in the village where I worked and lived. You see how how I mean, it sounds not sure how to but the duties that are assigned to village women tends to keep them busy for most of the day. And whereas if you are an intermediate caste landowning farmer, you have lots of time on your hands. And of course, that also, practically speaking, gives more the everyday rhythms and routines of village and family life automatically generate much more time and space for men to be political. I also thought that an everyday perspective also is good for nuancing uh, these broad categories of men and women, if you like, and to arrive at a more locally embedded intersectional perspective where you really see the stark differences between being a Dalit woman in Nadipara and then belonging to a respectable Chasi family in the village I call Shantipara. And the same can be said about the men, of course. Um, the this not only this movement, but many of these movements will these activists, they will travel to the state capital, or they will travel even further abroad, and they will represent their movement. They will give their speeches, and they will say what they want, and they will define the agenda vis-a-vis a broader public. In the person Ojoy I referred to in one of the opening vignettes, who was comes from a relatively poor Dalit family, he was beginning to be involved with some NGOs based in Kolkata, and also to go there occasionally for demonstration and activism. But even the cost, I mean, the cost of traveling to and from Kolkata, of buying your food in the city, and of being absent for a day from the village where he couldn't work and make his daily wage. That was, in a sense, enough to kill his, if you like, his broader activism. Huh? And that's because, to me, the simple point is that this collective action or struggles over land, they don't happen, they're not disconnected from the everyday lives that people otherwise live. They have to be somehow reconciled. They can be urgent and a kind of political emergency, but not forever. There are everyday lives that need to be lived, and that influence the different positions that are available to people to participate in these forms of collective action. So that's why I think an understanding of everyday life really is crucial if we want to understand these forms of collective action, not as flashpoints, but as something that plays out over time, short, intermediate, long-term temporal horizons.
That's really, yes, I think that's a point that is coming through very sharply, through your ethnographic work. I have one question from Deepa, who's watching us on YouTube, and I think Deepa is trying to talk a little bit about the sort of historical antecedents of particular places where uh, conflicts and collective action play out. And she's saying, I would like to ask how land dispossession can be understood when there are certain structures in place in some states like Kerala, where there is a legacy of social democracy, and yet there is a history of land alienation and encroachment.
Thanks for this question. I guess in a sense, the West Bengal context and the Kerala context are to some extent comparable, given the histories of land reform and land distribution, and the fact that they have been governed on and off by a regime with a certain social democratic orientation. Mukulika Banerjee spoke about the land reforms in the last talk, and that's of course significant here. I guess, I mean, well, how can it happen? I mean, there's probably both big and small explanations for this. Something, I think clearly it has to do with bigger processes related to the broader political economy, and the way in which land has become such a key instrument in the ways in which the different Indian states compete with each other and are made to compete with each other. I mean, it also came as a surprise, I think, to many when this kind of land dispossession happened in Bengal, both in Singur and Nondigram. How could a communist party that had built its long period in power based on intermediate, partly small farmers and agricultural laborers, how could one make sense of this kind of policy shift? It's not something that I have myself has worked on, but there's at least one study by Ritanjan Das on a book-length study on Bengal that actually that uncovers a much longer period of policy transition that leads even a communist government in Bengal into using land dispossession as a kind of development strategy. And I'm not aware of how these policy transitions have been played out in other states, but the work on Bengal, rather than seeing this as an overnight policy shift spurred by an overconfident chief minister in 2006, I think the merit of Ritanjan Das's book is that it tries to illustrate these kinds of piecemeal, partly improvisational responses by many different state governments in response to the uncertainties associated with gradual economic liberalization in India from the mid 80s, but accelerating from the early 90s. How can states respond to this? What are the opportunities that also open up? I mean, although Bengal was a critic of the communists could be critical of liberalization on ideological grounds, they could also see opportunities because some of the restrictions imposed on Bengal, which complained for many decades about stepmotherly treatment from the Delhi government, they were also to be removed. So I think this period of policy experimentation and trying to learn the ropes of a liberalizing economic environment, if you like, in some states, I think that history is worth looking into. And since I'm not intimately familiar with Kerala, I'm not sure if that history has been written, but we do have some indications from Bengal and also other states how even sort of states with a history of more or less effective pro-poor land reforms end up in the situation where the significance of land and its political implications change rather significantly in a very short time span.
Right, and I was just thinking that, I mean, there's moving beyond India, the literature on, let's say, China, and the large-scale dispossessions going on there, and how collective action then is taking forms which actually make a call on the state, and it's the guarantees that it gives people in the form of what they call rightful resistance. So there's stuff to sort of look at there, which probably might help to sort of to address this question. And I think there's been a lot of work also on, like Natalia Mamanova's paper on Ukraine, and the way in which responses played out in a post-socialist, this is a collectivized agrarian system, which was then opened for corporatization, and how the responses then are different. So yeah, lots to talk about, but I think it's a little past the time that we've asked Kenneth to be with us. Although it's been a fascinating discussion, I think I will have to now call it a day for today's discussion, as well as for the masterclass series. To do the wrap up, I invite Dr. Pudaditya Das from the School of Human Ecology, and to wrap this up and to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Asmita. It's my pleasure, to thank. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Kenneth Bo Nielsen for what can only be called a stunning lecture. One that helped us to understand not only rural conflicts and collective action, but also showed us this crucial ability for all researchers to think with theories, thinking with analytical frameworks, thinking against established canons, and thinking with our own material and ethnographic data. Thank you for taking us on this journey from empirics to theory, and for showing us how small places are valuable sites to study large issues. I thought of your class as a beautiful cooking class where you showed us how to wash, chop, marinate, add ingredients, stir slowly, taste periodically, and then revise the recipe as necessary. So thank you, Chef, for an inspiring masterclass lecture. I can see that once edited and uploaded on our planned masterclass website, this will be a valuable teaching and learning material for many students and teachers. Thank you. I also would like to thank the Dean at the School of Human Ecology, Dr. Suresh Babu, for always facilitating the seminar series and helping us execute the masterclass. Thank you to Professor Asmita Kabra for chairing and moderating this discussion, today's discussion, but for also conceiving the idea of the masterclass series, one that I would definitely, I think many would agree that has been a very valuable exercise. Thank you to Dr. Mekhla Krishnamurthy at Ashoka University for being a key conspirator in the idea, design, and execution for the masterclass series. Thank you to our audience for participation, for these wonderful questions. I think Kenneth has many things to think about from today's lecture. I would also like to thank people who are behind the scenes. Unfortunately, unlike a physical seminar, in a Zoom seminar, we can't call upon people at the end of the of a lecture and opportunity to we don't have the opportunity to thank them with a round of applause. But I would still like to talk about the people who've made this seminar series and the masterclass possible. The MA and PhD volunteers who sort of make sure that everything is works to perfection. For the masterclass series, I'd like to thank Mr. Anirudh Sheth, MA student, Mr. Shashank Bhardwaj, PhD scholar at the School of Human Ecology, our IT Services Division at Ambedkar University, Delhi for technical help and logistics, and Ms. Fizala Tayebullah at the Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability for designing the wonderful posters for this series. As we had mentioned in our in email invitations, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, we will not have the fifth lecture by Dr. Connor Kavanagh scheduled on the 4th of December. So effectively, this is the end of what Dr. Krishnamurthy suggested was the first season of the Masterclass series. Hopefully, our producers will agree and we will have newer seasons very soon. So watch out for
an agricultural metaphor in mind. I meant Kharif is now been in the market and Rabi is in the fields, but we can go. That also requires production.
Yeah, and hopefully we won't have a drought.
Yes.
Absolutely. So watch out for the school's Facebook page and our YouTube channel for details for the next editions, for the next season. We hope all the 4 masterclass lectures will be available soon, edited on YouTube, probably by the end of the month. So that it is available for wider viewing. And at the end, thank you. Stay safe, everyone. Those who have holidays at the end of the year, happy holidays. Those who have to continue teaching and learning because of the pandemic, soldier on. Goodbye from all of us here at the School of Human Ecology, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Thank you.